"What are you drawing?" Eleanor asked, peering over my shoulder at the intricate diagrams of interwoven branches and carved voids. "Looks like crop circle plans." "Better," I grinned, feeling a surge of righteous, creative spite. "I'm designing an internal hedge ventilation system, with artistic flourishes." "Uh-huh," she said skeptically. "And these flourishes wouldn't happen to be dead-end passages specifically aimed at driving Karen Henderson slowly insane, would they?" "I prefer to think of it as promoting airflow," I replied innocently, "and encouraging contemplation on the transient nature of pathways, deep within the shrubbery. There are things in life a man takes pride in. A well-organized workshop, a perfectly brewed cup of coffee, maybe even a respectable collection of vintage prog rock vinyl. For me, it was the hedge. Not just a hedge, mind you. The hedge. 10 glorious feet tall, a solid 6 feet thick, stretching 70 feet along the property line I shared with Karen. It was a magnificent specimen of Thuja plicata, the western red cedar, though everyone just called it arbor vitae. I'd planted the saplings myself 15 years ago, nurtured them, fed them, watered them, talked to them, yes, really, and trimmed them with the devotion normally reserved for religious relics or prize-winning poodles. It wasn't just a boundary marker, it was architecture. A living wall, dense and lush, providing absolute privacy, a windbreak, a haven for nesting sparrows, and frankly, a stunning backdrop to my modest suburban garden. The deep green foliage was so tightly interwoven, so perfectly sculpted through years of patient trimming, that it looked almost solid, like a great, verdant fortification guarding my little kingdom. "Spending quality time with your leafy obsession again, Arthur?" Eleanor, my infinitely more practical partner, called from the patio one perfect June afternoon. I was up on the ladder, meticulously snipping away minute imperfections with my favorite bypass pruners, feeling the satisfying snick resonate through my hands. "Just appreciating true craftsmanship, my dear," I called back, stepping down to admire the flawless vertical plane I'd just perfected. Nature's tapestry, guided by a master hand, mostly mine, with some help from photosynthesis. I ran a hand along the dense foliage. It felt cool, resilient, alive. Look at that density, not a gap in sight. Fort Knox has nothing on this baby. "Just try not to block out the sun completely," she teased. "And remember, Mrs. Henderson next door complained last year when your tapestry started annexing her bird bath." Ah yes, Karen Henderson, my neighbor. A woman whose primary hobby seemed to be finding fault with the universe, starting with everything on my side of the fence. We'd had minor skirmishes before, leaves daring to drift onto her unnaturally pristine lawn. The unacceptable cheerfulness of my wind chimes quickly removed. The time my sprinkler apparently deposited unauthorized moisture on her garden gnome. But the hedge seemed to hold a special place in her hierarchy of neighborhood grievances. Her opening salvo this time wasn't direct. It came via sonic warfare. Loud, pointed sighs carried on the breeze as she performed aggressive weeding near the fence line. Then came the monologue, delivered ostensibly to Chairman Meow, her perpetually unimpressed Persian cat sunning itself on her porch steps, but clearly intended for my benefit. "Such dense shrubbery next door, Chairman," she declared, her voice tight with disapproval. "Positively claustrophobic, blocks all the lovely morning sun from my poor zinnias, you know. And goodness only knows what sort of things might lurk deep inside such thickness. Probably spiders, or voles." I ignored her, concentrating on achieving perfect topiary symmetry. Spiders? Voles? The only thing lurking inside my hedge was more hedge, Karen. Dense, healthy, beautifully structured hedge. But Karen wasn't one to be ignored. A few days later, she caught me while I was admiring my handiwork, hands on hips, feeling the quiet satisfaction only a truly magnificent hedge can provide. "Arthur!" Her voice cut through the tranquil afternoon air like a rusty saw. She marched over to the fence line, clipboard somehow already in hand. She always seemed to have a clipboard at the ready, like a knight perpetually prepared to joust with perceived infractions. "Morning, Karen," I said, forcing a pleasant tone. "Something I can help you with?" I gestured vaguely towards the hedge. "Needs a trim on your side, perhaps? Happy to lend you my long reach cutters?" Her eyes, small and sharp, weren't looking at the neat exterior I presented to her side. They seemed to be trying to penetrate the dense foliage, X-ray vision fueled by pure disapproval. "It's not the height, Arthur," she stated flatly, "or the tidiness of the facing. It's the thickness." I blinked. "The thickness?" I repeated, genuinely baffled. "What about the thickness?" "It's excessive," she declared, tapping her clipboard for emphasis. "It's just abnormally dense. Look at it." She gestured wildly at the solid green wall. "It looms. It's oppressive. Hedges aren't meant to be impenetrable fortresses, Arthur." "Well," I began slowly, trying to wrap my head around this novel complaint. "Density is rather the point of a privacy hedge, wouldn't you say? Keeps things, private." "This isn't privacy, it's botanical hoarding," she insisted. "It probably harbors disease, mold, mildew. Who knows what fungal monstrosities are breeding in the dark, damp interior because it's too thick for proper air circulation." "Karen," I said, trying to channel my inner horticultural educator, "it's a perfectly healthy western red cedar hedge. They are naturally dense. That's their characteristic. And I assure you, the air circulation is adequate. See how green and vibrant it is?" "It looks unhealthy to me," she sniffed, unconvinced. "All bunched up, suffocating itself. It needs to be thinned out, drastically, at least 50%. Let some light and air into the poor thing." Thinning it by 50%? She wanted me to gut my masterpiece? Turn my verdant fortress into a skeletal wreck? The thought was horrifying. "Absolutely not, Karen," I said firmly. "Thinning a mature hedge like this would cause irreparable damage. It's perfectly fine as it is." "We'll see about that," she muttered darkly, making a furious note on her clipboard. "There are bylaws, about overgrown vegetation." She spun on her sensible heel and marched back to her house, leaving me staring after her dumbfounded. Complaining about thickness? That was a new low even for her. Naturally, the official paperwork followed swiftly. Not from the HOA this time, we didn't have one, thank God, but a formal-looking letter citing obscure municipal code sections about property maintenance and potential hazards posed by overgrown flora. The language was clearly Karen's, filtered through a thesaurus she probably kept next to her ruler. "The aforementioned coniferous barrier," I read aloud to Eleanor that evening, "exhibits excessive lateral density, henceforth referred to as thickness, potentially impeding natural light penetration to adjacent properties and creating conditions conducive to pestilential harborage and fungal proliferation." I snorted. Pestilential harborage? Is she writing a Gothic novel? "Furthermore," I continued, "said thickness presents an unneighborly visual weight, inconsistent with the open, airy aesthetic preferred within the Community Overlay District." I looked up. "We don't have an overlay district. She just made that up." The letter concluded with a demand for immediate remedial action to reduce hedge width by no less than 50%. 50%. within 14 calendar days to promote airflow, increase light penetration, and restore visual harmony. Failure to comply would result in formal complaints being lodged with the city zoning board and potentially require arboreal intervention at my expense. Arboreal intervention? Eleanor echoed, looking alarmed. Does that mean they'll send guys with chainsaws? Over my dead body, I growled. She wants me to butcher 15 years of work because she thinks my hedge looks too thick? Because it's doing its job too well? This wasn't just absurd, it was insulting. It was a declaration of war on my prize plant. My response was polite but firm. I wrote back to the city, copying Karen, of course, explaining the species of the hedge, its natural growth habits, its excellent health, and the horticultural vandalism that thinning it by 50% would represent. I attached photos. I quoted passages from the Royal Horticultural Society website about proper cedar hedge maintenance. I may have even subtly implied that Karen's pestilential harborage theory was botanically unsound and possibly libelous towards beneficial insects. This seemed to placate the city, who likely had better things to do than mediate disputes about hedge girth. They sent back a non-committal letter suggesting neighbors resolve landscaping issues amicably, which, with Karen, was like suggesting cats and dogs resolve their differences through interpretive dance. Denied official backup, Karen took matters into her own hands, or rather, into her pruning shears. I started finding evidence of her frustration near the property line. Branches on her side, previously perfectly aligned with my trimming, were suddenly hacked off crudely, leaving ugly stubs. One morning, I discovered a disturbing patch of yellowing, dying foliage low down near the base of the hedge, suspiciously close to where she'd been aggressively weeding the day before. It smelled faintly of chemicals. I marched over, fury simmering. "Karen!" I called across the fence, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did you spray something near the hedge yesterday? There's a large dead patch appearing on my side." She looked up from her zinnias, the picture of wide-eyed innocence. "Goodness me, Arthur, no!" she exclaimed, perhaps a little too quickly. "Heavens, I'd never spray chemicals near your lovely, thick hedge. Must be some sort of blight. Terrible shame. Probably because it doesn't get enough air circulation deep inside, you know. All that dampness. Foster's disease." She shook her head sadly, turning back to her flowers. I stood there, clenching and unclencing my fists. Blight? No. This was chemical warfare. She was actively trying to kill me hedge from the roots up, all because she thought it was too fat. That evening, I was inspecting the damage, gently parting the dense outer branches to see how far the yellowing extended. It was dark inside the hedge, a world of interwoven stems and shadowed leaves. As I peered into the green depths, I noticed Karen watching me intently from her kitchen window, her silhouette framed against the light, clearly trying to see what I was doing, what secrets the hedge's interior held. Her nosiness, her obsession with what lay within the oppressive thickness, was almost palpable. And that's when it hit me. The perfect, most beautifully appropriate retaliation. She wants to know what's inside? She's obsessed with the density, the hidden depths? Fine. I wouldn't thin it. I wouldn't reduce its presence. No, I would enhance its internal complexity. I would use its very thickness, the quality she despised, against her. I would give her something to peer at, something to puzzle over, something deep inside the hedge designed purely for her frustrated contemplation. I wouldn't just maintain the fortress wall, I'd build secret passages inside it, passages that led absolutely nowhere. A maze, a beautiful, pointless internal labyrinth, a hedge maze with no exit. I started sketching that night, a manic energy flowing through me. Not a traditional maze you walk through, of course. This would be architectural sculpture within the living plant, using the hedge's 6-foot depth as my medium. I planned winding internal corridors, small hidden clearings, abrupt dead ends, all carved deep inside the foliage, invisible from the street, barely noticeable even from my side unless you knew where to look. But from Karen's side, if she peered through the outer leaves, driven by her relentless curiosity, she'd glimpse intriguing dark openings, the start of pathways twisting into the green depths. Pathways that would inevitably, frustratingly, lead nowhere. "What are you drawing?" Eleanor asked, peering over my shoulder at the intricate diagrams of interwoven branches and carved voids. "Looks like crop circle plans." "Better," I grinned, feeling a surge of righteous, creative spite. "I'm designing an internal hedge ventilation system with artistic flourishes." "Uh-huh," she said skeptically. "And these flourishes wouldn't happen to be dead-end passages specifically aimed at driving Karen Henderson slowly insane, would they?" "I prefer to think of it as promoting airflow," I replied innocently, "and encouraging contemplation on the transient nature of pathways, deep within the shrubbery." The project required patience, precision, and secrecy. This wasn't a chainsaw job. It was bonsai on a giant scale. I sharpened my best Japanese pruning saw, my fine-toothed loppers, my smallest, most maneuverable hedge shears. I needed surgical tools for this kind of internal landscaping. Over the next few weeks, perhaps stretching into a couple of months, I began the delicate work. It became my private obsession. Early mornings, late evenings, moments stolen during the day when Karen was out. I'd reach deep into the hedge from my side, carefully selecting branches, visualizing the paths I'd designed. The work was physically demanding, reaching, stretching, contorting myself to get the right angles deep inside the dense growth. Scratches accumulated on my arms. My back ached. But the satisfaction was immense. With each carefully removed branch, a dark void would open up, hinting at depth and mystery within the solid green wall. Snip, saw, clip. I worked methodically, creating tight turns, small hidden alcoves, and the crucial dead ends. These dead ends were the punchline. I designed them to terminate just inches from the outer edge of the hedge on Karen's side. A solid wall of dense foliage would block the path, but from her vantage point, peering through the leaves, she'd see the tantalizing start of a passage leading deeper, only to find it abruptly ended. A botanical cul-de-sac. I had to be careful, of course. I didn't want to harm the hedge's overall health or create unsightly gaps on the exterior. My trimming on the outside remained impeccable, betraying nothing of the intricate work within. I bundled the internal cuttings discreetly and added them to the compost bin gradually, disguising my efforts as routine seasonal maintenance. "Just thinning out some dead wood," I'd call over cheerfully if Karen happened to be outside while I was working near the boundary. "Improving the airflow, like you suggested." She'd just eye me suspiciously, unable to pinpoint anything overtly wrong, yet sensing, perhaps, that something strange was afoot within the fortress wall. The internal maze grew, section by section. A winding path here, a sudden stop there. A small internal clearing revealing nothing but more tightly woven branches. It was becoming my secret garden, a labyrinth built not for walking, but for baffling. The moment of discovery came sooner than I expected. It was a Saturday morning. I was doing some light touch-up trimming on the top of the hedge when I noticed Karen in her yard, unusually close to the fence line, peering intently into the foliage. Not just glancing, but studying it. She moved slowly along the fence, stopping every few feet, parting the outer leaves slightly, her brow furrowed in concentration. She saw them, the dark openings, the hints of passages within. I watched, holding my breath, Shears paused in mid-air. I saw her follow the line of one of my carved tunnels with her eyes. Saw her lean closer, trying to see where it led. Saw the flicker of confusion when she realized it just stopped. She moved to the next opening I'd created, peered into its depths, and found another abrupt dead end. Her head snapped up, her eyes locking onto me up on my ladder. The confusion on her face morphed rapidly into dawning realization, then into pure, incandescent rage. "Arthur!" she shrieked, her voice vibrating with fury. "Arthur Pendleton! What have you done?" I calmly lowered my shears, feigning mild surprise. "Karen, is everything all right? You seem distressed." "Distressed?" she sputtered, marching right up to the fence, jabbing a finger towards the hedge. "Don't play innocent with me. You've carved things inside the hedge, tunnels, little roads. What is this madness?" "Oh, that?" I replied airily, wiping my shears on a rag. "Just doing a bit of internal structuring. Very beneficial for the plant's health, you know. Promotes airflow deep within the canopy. Helps prevent those nasty fungal things you were worried about." "Airflow?" she screeched, her face turning an alarming shade of crimson. "They're dead ends. Every single one of them. They twist around and then they just stop. It's a maze. A stupid, pointless maze with no exit." I allowed myself a small, benign smile. "Is it? How peculiar. I was simply following the natural growth patterns, removing congested branches here and there. Perhaps it just looks like a maze from your perspective. Fascinating optical illusion, isn't it?" She stood there, sputtering, momentarily silenced by the sheer infuriating plausibility of my denial. Complaining about the internal architecture of my hedge, she knew how crazy it sounded. But Karen wasn't one to give up easily. She tried. Oh, how she tried. She called the city code enforcement again. A bewildered officer showed up, listened to Karen's frantic description of the internal hedge tunnels leading nowhere, peered politely into the foliage where Karen pointed, and scratched his head. "Ma'am," he said eventually, turning back to Karen. "With all due respect, it's the inside of his hedge. As long as the exterior dimensions comply with setback and height ordinances, I'm not sure what city code violation you're alleging here. We don't really have regulations for internal shrubbery design." He apologized for not being able to help, and quickly departed. She apparently tried the HOA angle again, even though we didn't technically have one, just a loose neighborhood association she lorded over. The association president, old Mr. Abernathy, reportedly listened patiently on the phone, and then gently suggested she might find relaxing hobbies, like knitting more conducive to neighborhood harmony. She even, according to Eleanor, who overheard it from another neighbor, called a certified arborist, demanding he come out and condemn my hedge as structurally compromised by internal void creation. The arborist apparently inspected my careful work, declared the hedge to be in robust health, and the internal pruning unconventional certainly, but demonstrating a remarkable understanding of apical dominance and light management within a dense structure. He then charged Karen a hefty consultation fee. She was beaten, defeated by horticultural artistry and bureaucratic bewilderment. There was simply no rule, no ordinance, no conceivable complaint she could lodge against a man for carving pointless dead ends inside his own hedge. The maze remains. I maintain it dutifully, a secret known only to me, Eleanor, Karen, and anyone else who bothers to peer closely enough into the dense green wall. Sometimes I add a new twist, deepen a dead end, just for the sheer artistic satisfaction. It's my living sculpture, my testament to the absurdity of it all. Karen rarely speaks to me now. Sometimes when I'm out trimming, I catch her watching me from her window, arms crossed, face set in a permanent thundercloud. The other day, I finished trimming a particularly satisfying cul-de-sac deep within the foliage, stepped back to admire my handiwork, and noticed her glare. I gave her a polite, almost imperceptible nod, the kind one gives an acknowledged but utterly vanquished foe, and turned back to my work with my smallest, most precise shears. "Too thick," she said. "Honestly, some people just have absolutely no appreciation for depth."